So welcome to the second installment of our Advent series that we are putting on for the Chinook Winds region, for the Affirming Connections, and for the Urban Indigenous Circle. We're going to start, as we do with our sessions, with a smudge and a prayer to offer for a good meeting and for a good spirit to come to our gathering and to share here today, to be able to allow different perspectives and different understandings and hopefully a better connection. So I'll begin with this smudge. This is a blend of different medicines that we use in the Stony Nakota area, gathered from the mountains here in the Rocky Mountains near Banff, that we offer our prayers with. The prayers are done through this smudge, and the smoke from this rises up to take our prayers to the Creator. And so our elders do this every day. Our people practice our traditional spirituality and remember those teachings and the ways that we have been given. And so we'll offer our prayer here today with this smudge. Let us pray. Creator God, great mystery, one who centers and holds us, who brought us here into this creation at this time to experience this world. We pray for all those things that you have given us as gifts: the song, the air, the land, the waters, the things that help and nourish us and bring us into balance with the world around us. You have provided all that we need here in this space. May we learn to live within creation in a positive way, that we might be of benefit to the rest of creation in the work that we do, in the thoughts that we have. We pray for those who are ill, those who are suffering, and those who have lost loved ones during this time of this pandemic. We remember at this time those that we have learned from, those that have guided us, those that have taught us something of ourselves. Pray that at this time we would acknowledge the impact of their existence on our lives. On Chagezi Tuan Chezi, Jesus Christ, Manchapa Chezi, the Chagamakan Wahogu Marichin Narizi, Narigi Chabichan, the Hais Nagu Chetnia Ichia. Amen. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for taking part. We come here on the Chinook Winds Region Treaty number 7. I'll have you all sign into the chat if you can. Just a short thing of your name and of your local congregation or affiliation and your treaty area or indigenous area that you're hailing from in this time, and your pronouns as well. So in the Chinook Winds region, we reside in the territory of Treaty Number 7, which was signed in 1877 between the British Crown and the Indigenous people of Southern Alberta and the Church. My family, the Snow family, was one of the original signatories of this treaty, along with the Methodist Church that later became the United Church of Canada. As a signatory, we lift up the United Church's work when it comes to dismantling discrimination, to addressing injustices, and to creating a better balance in our institutions. The Chinook Winds region and the colonial framework of the provincial boundaries also includes the territories listed under Treaty Number 4 and Treaty Number 6, though we have much to do to address the needs and impacts of those regions today. Here is the map of all of the different areas here within Western Canada. So you have British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan listed in here, part of Manitoba. And in these areas, you can see the amount of territory for each different group. When we signed treaty, we came to the Treaty 7 area here at the bottom of the screen that comprise the Tsuut'ina people, the Blackfoot, the Blood, Stony, and Pagan people, each having a contribution to this area, having always existed in some form together. And so we remember those bonds, those relationships. So with the treaty relationship, we also remember that we take heart that the treaty message has always been one of peace. We remember that though we have endured much racism, discrimination, and hardship because of systemic inequalities and biases, we are here today to work together to achieve a better balance. Even in the face of insurmountable odds, still we persist. And by persisting, we are beginning to see change. Here, I just want to recap from our last gathering on last Thursday with, excuse me one sec, with Adele Halliday, presenting on some of the history of the anti-racism portion of this. And we'll expand this next week as well, as we talked about Two-Spirit people and the LGBTQ influences on this timeline. So I've incorporated here some of the lessons that Adele has and some of the lessons that I've been teaching over the last year on this timeline and the relation to our United Church history. So one of the points was during the 1960s, the relations of the United Church of Canada and the Indigenous people began to change. In 1986, this led to the first apology called upon by Alberta Billy to talk about colonialism and the effect of colonialism on people. The second apology that happened in 1998 was the apology for residential schools. In 2000, there was a United Church anti-racism policy adopted, which is the same time that they started affirming the Affirming Congregations program, which was endorsed in 2000. It had existed in 1991, but in 2000, it became endorsed and started being adopted into different churches. 2006, the intercultural church commitment came into being. In 2008, the residential school settlement was signed. In 2009, there was a commitment to inclusion at the General Council. And in 2012, there was an intercultural vision adopted. So each of these moments, we're seeing the progression of different voices in that Indigenous, intercultural, racialized people, people of color, being acknowledged and brought into this fold. And so 2015, for the Indigenous Church, the TRC recommendations, the calls to action were adopted. 2016, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was also adopted. 2017, the calls to the church were approved from the caretakers of the Indigenous circle. And so the elders of that circle provided a framework to the United Church on how to do this type of inclusion work and what ministry will look like in the future. And a very influential document, I think, for the work that we're doing today. In 2020, so the anti-racist denomination declaration and commitment were made on October 24th. And so that's a brief overview of where we've been to date. And it's kind of a recap of the work that we had last week from Adele, and who's here tonight, and to continue on that path of understanding. And this is the second installment of our Indigenous Advent series. This teaching, I think, reflects a lot of where we are working toward tonight. In our second teaching of this cycle, Ogichichubi means to have generosity, means to share with one another. It is a core value of our communities that we reach out and that we provide for others. Growing up, oftentimes my father, as chief of our nation, would take the time to take hampers, to take food, to take gifts to our elders and to provide for them so that he would always have a connection to them and they would always be taken care of. And that is a leadership role. That is part of the work of the church. That is part of the work of community building. That is part of the work of being included in this larger family of people that we want to embrace and live out in a good way.
Generosity means our teaching again, indigenous culture, is always to share with others. That way, you will learn more, you will get more, because our teachings in Stony is educational and religious. So generosity would be sharing with others. Ogichi Chubi. Ogichi Chubi means generosity.
And so now, as we take the time to welcome each and every of you here, we also welcome all of our people who have agreed to take part in this event. From our co-host here, Pam Rocker and Deborah Richards as well, from the Pacific Mountain region. Pam, would you like to say hello? And a few words about the process we're engaged in here.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Thanks for that beautiful opening. My name is Pam Rocker. I'm the director of Affirming Connections, and we do a lot of work to promote the affirming work of amazing ministries in Southern Alberta and beyond, and also help other individuals and churches discern how they can continue to be affirming in their own contexts. Our work is supported by Chinook Winds Region and St. Andrews Regional Ministries, and it's such a pleasure for me to get to work with Tony as we had the chance to work together at McDougall United many years ago, and so it's been lovely to get to partner together again. One of the reasons why we chose the specific sort of subtitle of this series, a public, intentional, and explicit conversation about anti-racism in the church, is because that's sort of the lexicon that we've been using about how to measure how affirming is working for you, whether as an individual, a lay person at your church, or as a clergy member. So what are we doing that is public, where people know who we are and what we're about, that's intentional, that we have conversations about, that we put resources towards, and that's explicit, where people will know where we stand, and that, you know, we can find, as Irshad Manji would say, find a common ground while standing our ground. So this sort of translates to this conversation that we're having. How do we not just, you know, sort of say, you know, we don't want to be racist, but how do we actually live into PIE, that PIE, in what it means to be anti-racist as people and as people of faith and as a domination. So I'm so pleased for us to be able to support this. And I welcome you tonight to hear from the amazing folks that have lots of learnings for us to be able to listen to. So thank you, and back to you, Tony.
Thanks. Next we have Deborah Richards. Maybe just say hi and a little about yourself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Deborah Richards, and I am from the Pacific Mountain region. I am the coordinator for intercultural ministries. I've been doing that about a year in our network, and I'm very pleased to be here and be able to participate. In our first session last week, I participated by asking questions as well as bringing forward some of the questions that are in the chat. this discussion, this intentional discussion. It also makes us think about and weave into our thinking that whole concept and vision of being an intercultural church. And I hope that we will continue to keep that in mind as we have the conversations this evening. Back to you, Tony.
First up, we have Paul Walfall, who is the Reverend at First United Church in Fort Saskatchewan, and is has been instrumental in the work of the anti-racist movement, and a long-time advocate for this type of inclusion with the United Church, and has always worked faithfully to help in numerous committees and numerous groups to bring that voice and bring that understanding of what it means to be included. And I think if you check out I'll put out the clip in a bit for Paul's talk at the GC 43 in 2018 to introduce the um, perspective of racism within the church, and the voices that followed, the voices that were unencumbered by the situation of the gathering, and wanted to express, I think, that sense of belonging and that sense of um, addressing a long felt hurt and trying to work toward a better way of listening to one another and of being in space together. So, welcome, Paul, and thank you for taking part in our discussion today. And I'm glad that you are able to share your perspectives and your experiences with us here.
Thank you. I am humbled to be invited, number one. Humbled that over 60 people really think that it's important enough to come and listen to me on a Thursday evening, when I'm certain there are many other things they could be doing with their lives at this time. I thank you for the invitation, and it's good to be here. It's good to touch base with my friends in Southern Alberta, since the great divide of Highway 13 separating Northern Spirit from Chinook winds. I've missed some of my colleagues in the South that I would have been rubbing shoulders with at least annually. Good. It's good to see you all, and it's good to be you. I think the first thing I would want to say at this point is to emphasize that what happened at the last General Council was not planned. I was invited to be intercultural observer, and Adele tried her best, honestly, to remind me that I was simply there to observe and to reflect on what I was seeing. And myself and Sharon Ballantyne were the intercultural observers. However, when I arrived at General Council, I did not come with a predetermined script. I wanted to experience and then reflect. But from the very beginning of the General Council, there was this quiet in my soul, a dis-ease, which could have caused a disease in my life, that I felt invisible. I felt that I did not see representation of myself or people looking like me in the midst of the General Council experience. And it started from the opening worship, and the opening worship was lovely. I want to make that point very clear. I'm not criticizing it. It was a lovely experience. But I noted that there was nothing of only the hymnody of North America or Europe was being included in the worship. I heard nothing of the Caribbean experience. And to one extent, it was noteworthy to me that um, there was one hymn that we sang, and it was from Africa, but it was sung in French and English. And it struck me that we're using a song from Africa, but we're using the language of the colonizers. um, and that disquiet went with me, and I remember the Wednesday evening when I sat down to write my reflection. Um, that is what came out. That there was a feeling that it was nice and dandy. Um, Everything is good, but I felt invisible. I felt that the experiences of my life was almost being taken for granted. And so I wrote. And the experience at General Council was continuous with experiences I had outside of the General Council. Um, I mentioned in the speech that there was a point where one of my colleagues here in Alberta, uh, well-meaning, I think, at the time, was that we had a discussion about race at a meeting determining about pastoral relations. The person said, Paul, when I see you, I don't see your the color. I don't see color. And in typical Paul Walfall fashion, I laughed and said back to him, well, I'm invisible then, because if you're not seeing my color, then you're seeing right through me. Um, and there were various aspects of trying to avoid a topic of race. And what followed after that again um, was not anticipated. Those who know me will tell you that I am implicitly a shy individual. I do not seek the limelight. What gets me in trouble very often is my mouth. So I tend to say it as I see it. There is a national narrative, what I call a national narrative in Canada. National narrative that paints a picture of Canada that is not historical, that is not the truth. It is good to hear the narrative, but unfortunately, it's not the truth. The national narrative paints a picture of um, of almost a very cuddly relationship between the indigenous people and the colonizers, and it's anything but the truth. The national narrative paints a picture that, Canada was the haven for the enslaved from United States running away from slavery, and all black people are generally accepted in Canada. And while that is good and that it holds a kernel of truth, it is not the complete truth. It is not the complete fact. Um, Many people are still surprised to hear that there was slavery in Canada in what was the British North American experience. And even when we do acknowledge it, there's a sense of trying to 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 mold it into a narrative that's acceptable. Oh well, there was slavery already with the indigenous people, and the indigenous people already had slavery of sort, and failing to forget that the type of slavery that the enslavement of Africans made them chattels, property, and the indigenous people did not practice that form of slavery. It did not dehumanize people in that way. So yeah, they will say, yeah, let's call it for what it is. Um, and it was, and we try to modify it by saying, well, it wasn't as bad as it was in America. Well, people, slavery, anyway, chattel slavery. When we take it shape, form, or size, you can dress it up. You can take it and even powder it off and pour cologne on it, but it's still what it is.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's still what it is. And so when, for example, last year when we try to make the point of, let's acknowledge emancipation, the 1st of August as emancipation. Even in Canada, many people were wondering, really, was there slavery here? We speak about the Underground Railroad, and fail to recognize that many of the enslaved who came here did not find open arms of cuddling and warm embrace. They found resentment and racism, and we sort of cut out of history the reverse Underground Railroad, that many who came went back
Mhm.
because they were, because then the racism that was felt. We don't speak about the reality that even here in Alberta, in Amber Valley, that when the indigenous people were forced off their land, and suddenly there was free land available or cheap land available, and
Mhm.
the government opened up for people to come. That lo and behold, much to their surprise, the black people from Louisiana were coming up because they were moving away from the type of experience with the KKK. And what they found when they came in was deep um, racism, even here in Alberta, to the point where they were sending preachers. They were hiring black preachers to go down to the States to tell them, don't come, don't come.
Mhm.
Um, where the immigration policies of Canada up to the 1960s into the 1970s was implicitly um, anti-black, anti anybody who was not European. Where it was stated by commissioners of immigration that the climate was not conducive for black people to work. And it is only after the great changes in the 1960s in the immigration policy where the things were opened up. We don't speak about the KKK at work in Canada, and let's talk silently about how the former churches, the antecedent churches of the United Church and the United Church was involved with promoting the KKK in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Let's just pass that one. So when we speak about racism in Canada, we're speaking about something that is real. It's not just a perception; it's a real thing. And persons in of who have my color skin, and persons who are deemed to be people of color and indigenous people face this in a very real way, um, oftentimes in a very disguised way. Um, my son will tell you, one of my sons will tell you, that when he arrived in Canada in 2013, everybody wanted to touch his hair. And the invasion of his personal space was just taken as for granted. Um, Everybody was coming to touch his hair. And one day at school, somebody came to give him $1. Why? Because you'll need this because I understand you come from poor circumstance. Don't know nothing about the child, but you're showing pity for him. Of course, in true Paul Wolford fashion, I had to say to him, you need to say to him, I worth more than $1. Come with $100,000, and then we can start. That's another story for another day. I can tell you about the experience of my youngest son going when we moved to Fort Saskatchewan, coming home one day, frightened, terrified, because he's confronted in the washroom by students who told him, take your end self back to where you came from. And if you dare speak about it, what we will do to you and your family. And these are students at a junior high school. Um, and but the national narrative is one. We are congenial people, and we will apologize. Canadians are friendly and will smile, but beneath the smile there is also something else. Should I talk about the fact that my elder son, when he was going to Grand McEwan University one day, while at the LRT station in Edmonton, he's standing with two white friends who are waiting on the LRT as well, and the police comes up and he's standing between two white students, and he's the only one that they've come to ask for his ID and an explanation of what is he doing at the LRT.
Hmm.
And I can go on, and we must not believe that it happens outside of the church. It happens within the church too. When I say to you that up to 2 years ago, on average, a Black minister has to make at least 80 applications for a posting in the church.
Hmm.
80 on average. Um, and many of my Black colleagues will tell you things go well until the first interview when they see me and they hear my accent, and then all sort of excuses are made. When I hear churches say to me, and I have heard persons say to me, I don't mind a new minister, but not one of these strange accents. Or when um my former spouse can tell you of when she interviewed for a position here in Alberta, who drove to the place, had a lovely interview, but was told, sorry, we did the committee did not want to hire, didn't feel they were ready for a female at this time, which of course raised red flags. And less than a month later, they hire a female, a white female. So the issue wasn't gender. It wasn't gender at all. Um, but it doesn't detract from the feeling of invisibility. Um, I shouldn't have to make excuses for my accent.
Hmm.
I shouldn't have to. When persons say to me, and in my congregation in Fort Saskatchewan, it's understandable that people say, Paul, you're talking a little too fast. Just slow down. I'm not offended by that. I'm not. I accept that I have a tendency of racing along, especially if I get excited in an Deb shaking her head. But what I take offense to is when you say to me that my accent, you cannot understand me because of my accent. And in my mind, I say, you know that I'm trying my best to understand yours.
Hmm.
I'm really trying my best. So the movement to become an anti-racist church is not a movement to simply say that we are not racist. And I want to make that point abundantly clear. Just saying that we are not racist is not good enough. The movement to be an anti-racist church is to be intentional about seeking to be to root out racism, systemic racism where it occurs in our church and where it is present, either in practice or in policy, and to move in a way that says that we are constantly reflecting upon ourselves so that we can truly respect the imago Dei, the image of God in each person. So when we make the declaration that we are an anti-racist denomination, we're saying that we're seeking to be intentional. We're seeking to be persistent and explicit. We're seeking to constantly engage in that type of reflecting where we see it, to humbly acknowledge and confess it, and do better. I think it was Dr. Imran Kendi who makes the point that confession is the soul of anti-racism.
Hmm.
Where you see it, to confess and to move on and recognize that every now and then we will see it within ourselves. And to make the point extremely clear again, when I say to you that I am a part of a racist denomination, I'm meaning no offense to anybody. I'm not making a value judgment on anybody. I'm not making a question of people's moral standing. You know, yes, we are all good and Christian people, but when I say there is racism in Canada and within the church, I'm saying systemically there are issues where power has colluded with a question of bias, and in that point, it causes a certain disadvantage to people, to people who are indigenous. And in my doctoral study, I did a very not even properly scientific study. And what are I gave a range of things. If you had a choice of a minister you wanted, what would you choose? I gave eight categories. The first choice was always a white Canadian. Second choice was a white Canadian, possibly French. The third, and this was what shocked me. Third, we would take a European or an Australian. Then came indigenous, then came black, and at the bottom of the list was somebody from South Asia. But at the same time, said congregations could respond and say, no, we don't have a problem. We don't have a problem with people of color. So if you're going to give that type of ranking, and then you're going to say there is no problem with somebody of color, then Houston, we have a problem. we have a problem there because there is there is a question of how we acknowledging who we are. And I think there's a point where we have to lay aside the feeling bad or the feeling sad and the feeling guilty and just acknowledge, hey, this is the reality of where we are at church. And the movement to become anti-racist, I'm certain Adele has said it already, especially now as we're looking at it in the United Church. The strength of the United Church of Canada is also the weakness of the United Church of Canada. The strength of the United Church gives a certain amount of liberty and freedom to the local congregation. There's some things that cannot be imposed on the local congregation. That strength is also our weakness, because you see, as has happened with the apology, the question of right relations, so now with the issue of racism and even of interculturality, we make good and lofty statements at General Council. You know, if you read the literature coming out of General Council on on on, on interculturality, right relations, on LGBTQ plus issues, lovely literature. I mean, I've been sending literature to people all over the world who have been asking me about it. But it's when you move down the ladder and come to the individual congregations, then there seems to be a question: how has that filtered down to what I call the grassroots? And so now when we discuss anti-racism in the church, one of the points constantly I've been making and others have been making, that there must be a dynamic dialogue between all levels of the church. It can't just stay up at general council. We must be talking about what happens at the local level. And it has to occur at the local level because pastoral relations occur at the local level. And if your black minister or your black people in your church feel that they are not truly part of the congregation, then there's precious little the general council can do. It's something that we must take on with the local church to start getting involved with. So my little plea at this point, and I will shut up in a minute, to say, let us not get our egos caught up into the process. This is not an attack upon your spirituality, your morality, or nothing. It is simply a point of saying, hey, if we're honest with ourselves, the national narrative is not telling the complete truth. Let us now face, let us, in the words of the writer of the letter of James, let us look in the mirror and see what we see and not walk away with a deception. And painful it may be, refreshing or cathartic it may be, let us look in the mirror and see. Because, you know, at the end of the day, racism in its various forms, whether it be to a Black person or a indigenous person, comes from one basic problem: a false narrative that says that human beings are and we're not. You caught me right now, my blood is red. If it turns out being green, then you need to take me to the hospital. Something is wrong. I think I've gone on.
Great, great. I think we'll ask a couple of questions, and I'm sure Deborah has some as well, or others. If you have questions, please include them in the chat. One of the things that because you've been involved with a lot of the committees and a lot of the work that's going on currently around the white privilege, dismantling white privilege group, and now into those racialized reference groups that have been sort of addressing this question of anti-racism within the church and instrumental in some of that movement. What is your hope around that, and what do you see from that is giving you hope or giving you a better insight into where you stood in 2018?
Well, just a little correction. I was not on the dismantling white privilege group. I was a part of what was the General Council Executive anti-racism group, and that came up because we addressed one day an issue at the General Council Executive where a Black minister from Africa returned back to Africa after experiencing racism here in Kenya, and after a very painful meeting that day, the decision was that, okay, we needed to form a committee, a working group of ourselves to see what concrete decisions can be done. I want to go beyond just 2018. I want to take the full scope. Because the anti-racism and the issue is around 40 years long, as you pointed out in the thing. At points, it can seem that we're going one step forward, two steps backward. I feel that right now, with the movement towards what we call the common table and really getting together all of the various players that have been looking at racism, anti-racism in the church, into the common table and trying now to work out a strategy. I think that is a forward-moving process. So I'm hopeful for that. The question I think that we constantly are struggling with is the question of how do we engage the communities of faith and the regions in this process and engage intentionally that the entire church is involved in this process and not just general council.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful, and I will continue to wrestle with that movement. It gives me hope. This year, 2020 will be noted for many things. It is the year many things happen. It will be the year we really want to see come behind us. But one of the things that the issue of racism really came to the fore. I think we're acting on that movement, and I think it's a chaotic moment, the movement of the Holy Spirit at this point.
I'm gonna turn the mic over to Deborah if he has another question to add.
I do. Paul, I appreciated where the conversation is going about taking action and engaging the entire church. And you said that there must be a dynamic dialogue on being anti-racist. What does that look like for you? And I know, there could be a whole host of things, but if you're thinking about what that dialogue might be, where might we start with that dialogue?
Well, one of the ways we can start is by simply asking ourselves in our various congregations and at regional meetings, how are we seeking to be anti-racist?
Mm.
With that simple question, and in the first 5 minutes, we will come with the general stuff, the massaging of what we have done, 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 and good. After you're finished putting down what you have done, let us start talking about what we have not.
Mm.
You know, and then don't gloss over it. Let us just look at what do we need to be doing. Let us look around the room and see to ourselves, who are we seeing in the room? Who are we seeing in our congregation? The largest concentration of Black people in Alberta are in the two major cities of the province, Edmonton and Calgary. Calgary has and Edmonton have large Black populations. Yet still, it is interesting that many of our churches are still of one particular homogeneous race,
Hmm.
Mhm.
which I shall not call. And the same thing happens, I think, in Toronto and other places. So if we are serious about reaching, about reflecting the community around us, and we're serious about being anti-racist, then we have to ask ourselves, in what ways have my congregation been both inviting and welcoming of people of other races? And this is not the time to start making excuses, but to say, have we really been welcoming? If when I walk into a church, all eyes are on me
Hmm.
from the moment I walk in to when I leave. Um, one of the things I remember, when I came to Fort Saskatchewan, I kept on people saying, "But Paul, you don't seem to be trying to meet out with people." And I said, "Well, number one, I'm simply a shy person. But what do I do when I go somewhere and everybody's staring at me? The first thing I want to do is run and find the door. Get me out of here." And so there are some soul searching points I think that all of us need to ask. When we look on our in the region that I'm part of, I raised a point with them last year. We have uh we have 11 at the time, 11 Black ministers of persons of color who are ministry personnel in the church. But yet you look at a committee such as the Pastoral Relations Commission, and at the time there was no person of color on the commission. And then I'm to say, but something is wrong when you look at that combination. So, and I'm not, and again, please hear me. I'm not making a negative criticism of the pushing jobs. I'm simply saying
Hmm.
it's time for us to look at what may be the normative experience and say, really, what is this saying about us?
Mhm.
Whoa. And,
Yeah.
and, and so I think at every level, and it starts with a question: how are we seeking to be anti-racist?
Hmm. It's interesting. I'm thinking about in our urban populations where we have a lot of diversity, we don't have a lot of diverse clergy in those areas that correspond. That would maybe make a more natural fit for bringing in people from the local community to take part in those church activities if they see a person that reflects who they are,
But
as opposed to
even if
yeah.
not, take the people coming in at least form make a point of identity and sensitivity to people.
Yeah.
The- as you know, Tony, from your nation, there are ways of doing things. There's an internal culture to how you operate. And for me, as outsider to it, if you were not there to tell me certain things, I would
Mm.
be totally lost. I would misinterpret what you're doing. You know, Deborah and I are Jamaicans, and I'm certain if we were to get together and start to talk, and if you'd be wondering what in heaven's name are they doing? And it's not just the talking; it will be the looks, the stares. A simple thing. For example, in Jamaica, if I say to somebody, There's not a word spoken there. It's just it's a sound. But if I were to turn to Deborah and say,
Mhm.
Deborah knows exactly what I'm saying. I've just given her a paragraph. And so it's the sensitivity of that cultural reality that if persons aren't sensitive and a person not on staff who are sensitive to it, then you're missing the point. You're flying over the people's head. So you may not take them in, but people may not want to come into the number of bombs that come into the queue. But it's how do you minister effectively to the people who are out there?
Mhm.
If I have no understanding of the culture and the nuance of culture, I would say, then I'm lost at sea.
It's
Mhm.
interesting that you say that and talk about behaviors, cultural perspectives, norms that we don't think about. And in the chat, Ross made the point, and he has a question. He says, I had a conversation with anti-racist friends about whether it is appropriate or helpful to identify specific people as racist. Isn't it better to identify specific behaviors, practices, policies, which I think is what you were saying there, Paul. Um, you know, so comment on that and maybe
I,
Tony as
we,
well.
we are moved generally to speak of systemic racism, that there is a systemic experience around us
Mhm.
which holds power and bias together. Remember, racism is not just that you have a bias, and it's that the power, the social structures and the powers of the structures enforce that bias and that hegemony. So it is better to speak of systemic racism than to speak of um, personal
Mhm.
racism. But however, with a caveat that there may be times you have to do that.
Mhm.
I believe that at times you have to call a, 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 a shovel a shovel and not simply a garden implement that has a particle. And
Yeah.
sometimes you have to name it for what it is.
Yeah.
And if in a context somebody is being um blatantly outlandish with it, you need to call it. When I stood in a congregation and somebody says, we need to put that little black boy in his place, and I'm looking around the place to see who's the black person in here because I'm the only black person here.
Mhm.
That had to be called out for what it is.
Mhm.
There was it wasn't only systemic; it was a reality.
Hmm. Just checking if we have any other questions. Let's check with my brother John if he's there.
I was trying to unmute.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just
Yes.
wanted to Paul's last point. Vine Deloria in God is Red talks about the attitude of people towards indigenous or aboriginal people, and he says it is the contemporary attitude towards peoples, the aboriginal peoples, the indigenous peoples, that must be changed rather than the compensation for past wrongs. So that change in attitude is something that talks about behaviors. It talks about many things. And when we go through reconciliation and think that we've done a cash settlement, we think that the guilt is gone, but the attitude remains. So it's important to know that the attitudes need to change. And so, as Christians, what Deloria is talking about is Christians must disclaim the use of history as a weapon of conquest. And these are part of the things that we need to be discussing as a church. Where do we stand? knowing these things? What is it saying to us? What is the Spirit calling us to do as individuals, as congregations,
Mhm.
as churches? What are we being called to do? Thank you.
I agree with you. When was it? 2017 in Alberta, we had the beginning of an awkward conversation, and that was an intentional movement to have a conversation about racism and particularly anti-black racism. And it was fortunate that we had the Black Clergy Network meeting in Edmonton at the time, and said that we was able to have moving from that network meeting into the conversations. One of the interesting things I found that many people at this when we're speaking about racism started to cry, and apologizing for the thing. And almost all of my colleagues, black colleagues, says, honestly, we really don't need the tears. What we
Hmm.
want is change behavior. You know, um, you feel bad if you must, but that that's really not what this is about. What if and it's very in keeping with Christian theology actually. Um, Change, metanoia, repentance is not about feeling bad. You can feel bad and guilty from now on till the cows come home. You're still all if that's all you're doing is feeling bad and guilty. Metanoia is about change, it's a reorientation of your behavior, of your outlook. And I think and metanoia and repentance does not again it's not you see we get tied up on this thing of people believing there's a moral implication or you're judging. No, ever so often I have to repent. I have to change my outlook. I have to change how my way of being, even with my own children. And they will tell you I'm not afraid to apologize to them. So if we are unwilling to repent, to confess and change our behavior and outlook, then we of all people are most to be pitied.
Hmm. I'm going to ask Adele, who's here, to provide a few words.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tony, for the invitation, and thank you, Paul, for all your insights shared this evening. Yes, to all that Paul has said, I think I would just maybe continue to re-emphasize that the commitment to becoming an anti-racist denomination is a commitment for the whole church. Paul said this already, and just want to emphasize it again. This is not a commitment for the General Council. It's not a commitment for people in Toronto. This is the whole church, and it's a commitment that was created by people of the church for the church. It's an aspirational vision of saying this is what we want to be. This is a vision. It's kind of the kingdom of this is what we are aiming for. So how do we do it? How do we get there? It's a call. It's all of what Paul was naming, metanoia, the repentance, it's a movement that we are called to by the Spirit in terms of becoming something that we are not yet. And I know some people uh, were troubled by the language. What do you mean become an anti-racist denomination? Do you mean that does that mean that we are racist? And to that, I would actually just say yes. Yes, we
Just
let's
name
just
it.
name it.
Name it.
We'll just name it and say, okay, sometimes we spend a lot of time as Canadians trying to be polite and come up with
Mm.
we just need to name it, claim it, and say this is where we have been, but we want to do better. We want to change and we want to do something different. So how do we figure out how we dismantle racism in the way that we have been church together in all of our structures, in our ways of worship, and how do we do that? That's our call at the moment. So my encouragement is let's not spend a lot of time worrying about whether we're racist or not, whether this person is or not. Let's just name it and say part of our call is to figure out how we become anti-racist. So let's focus on that. Let's focus on the journey. Let's focus on the effort. Let's focus on what we want to become, knowing that this is a calling of the Spirit. And it's been decades. Tony pointed out that the history timeline, this is not new in
No.
2020. This has been work we've been working on it for a long, long, long time. And yes, there have been lots of gains that have been made, and there's still more work to be done. So I think we could maybe take encouragement by saying, you know what, we've been doing this for a long time, and there has been some progress, and that's great, and we can celebrate that. And we still have more to do. So let's keep on doing that work together. All of us as people of the church, all of us who are, moving to become a better place of belonging. And it's, and part of why we're doing it is all of these terrible stories that you've heard again from Paul about this has been some of the reality, the lived experience of people who are in our communities. How do we change the story? Anyway, we are people of stories. We can change the story. We can change the story. So anyway, those are just a few words. So
Well, thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you to Paul for sharing. I really, really appreciate your words. I appreciate your candor. It's very, very important to do. It's making oneself vulnerable for the benefit of others. And so I really hope that others did some learning through your sharing. It's very important. I think that the other thing when we talk about racism, that's very important as a church. When we talk about being anti-racist, it means we have to change. I heard John say, yes, you have to change your attitudes. You do. And it has to change the way you think, the way you see, and the way you feel about any other. And that includes anybody who doesn't fit the description of a privileged white person. And that is largely who comes to church. But we have to acknowledge that. And we need to change that. So I'm on a number of boards. So I sit on the board for the Longhouse Native Ministries. I'm on the Pacific Mountain Region, the Council Executive. I'm on the PDCs. I'm on the BC Native Ministries, the National Indigenous Council. And then I also do other boards for the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Coalition here in BC, the Elizabeth Fry Society here in BC, and I sit on the board for Squamish Nation Finance Committee because that's where I'm from. And I see this quite a lot. We have lots of non-Indigenous organizations who think they're doing good, but the policies are racist and it's in the policy. So when we talk about racism, it's baked into society, like it's baked into the cake. How do you peel it out after it's already baked in? It's in all of our institutions. It's in our public schools, our justice systems. It's in our laws that govern us. It's in the laws that oversee us provincially, federally, municipally, district, any which way you see. It's as long as you're not the white person, then it doesn't really apply to you. It's just oppressing the people that are most vulnerable, anybody who doesn't fit in that box. And we need to actually name it to change it. And as part of the church with GC43, racism was a huge issue, and it's pervasive in the church. Lots of lateral violence inside the church. And I think that through education, it's part of the work that has to happen. But I think it's more than just the education. It's also learning about one another, learning how to be in relationship with one another. And what I find a lot of times in the Indigenous ministries is the churches want to learn about what it means to be Indigenous, but they're too afraid to be in relationship with Indigenous folks. For example, I had a call from a church out here in BC. Please introduce me to the local First Nation. I want to meet them. I want to know what I have to do. Instead of just going and remembering that, we all just want to be treated just like everybody else. Like if you wanted to be friends with me, then goodness, come and say hello. get to know me the same way, you want to know them. You're going to have to go in, and they were waiting for an invite. I'm like, well, you're going to wait a long time because that's never going to happen. You need to go into the community and put yourself out there and make friends with them. Like, if you want to have good relations, you have to go into it and have a relationship, and it needs to be reciprocal. It needs to be reciprocated, not a one-way relationship. And we want to have good, healthy relationships with each other. That's the other thing. So in Indigenous ministries, I can say I'm largely disappointed in the church, because in the church, there's so much lateral violence when I'm sitting at those tables, and it's my own people. So they're attacking me, but so are the people in the church. I just kind of want to address that too, in terms of that lateral violence. I want to say that as an Indigenous person, having survived colonialism and being an intergenerational trauma survivor, that they learned this behavior in church. They learned this at the residential schools it was their job to take the Indian out of the child. Um, it's so insane to me, that would be something the church would think is a good idea, because you can't take who we are away from us. Like, we are who we are, and just like any other is as they are. God created us all to be different because he wanted to love us in that and be okay in that. It's taken me a long time to come to a place where I get to love myself and accept myself as I am. And I want to thank Tony for all the very good work that he does and the good education that he provides to the Chinookans. They're very lucky to have you, Tony. You do a very good education series, and you educate the church in a really good way. For me, when I hear about the anti-racism, to me it's a campaign. And I don't want to just, like, I agree with you, Paul, like, you can't just say you're not racist. That's not enough. We need to change how we're doing church. We need to change how we're operating as a church, and that starts with our policies. We need to look at our policies, and we need to be doing better. So, for example, Indigenous ministries, I can tell you that we have 11 in BC, and I think we have about 200 non-Indigenous churches in British Columbia, and I can say that none of them have really reached out to the Indigenous ministries. And you don't have good relations even in our own region. And so that's a failing of our churches not coming together. We say we're united, but how? A relationship. So, I feel like we have a lot of work to do, even in our own region, in terms of coming together to be united, to get to learn about one another, to learn how to be in good relations. And I find that people find it very hard when I'm direct, but I'd rather tell the truth and be able to move through that, because I'm in a place where, I've lived and suffered for a long time, but I feel like honesty is going to bring you a lot farther, and I think it helps others come along with you. But it's very hard for them to hear. It's humbling. So anyhow, I'm doing a lot of work in terms of like right now I'm doing a project for human rights. So we talk a lot about the systemic racism that happens inside all of the institutions, and how Indigenous folks aren't willing to file a human rights case because of the institutions they have to deal with. And I think it's the same thing in our church. I think it's the same thing in society for a number of institutions. It includes things like the healthcare. I'm working for Fraser Health right now, and we just had a scathing report on In Plain Sight. Like, it's a bad report on the treatment of Indigenous folks trying to get healthcare. And I can tell you that we also experience that racism in those institutions and the services that are provided from the police department, the healthcare system, the education system. It's in everything. So if we really want to be anti-racist, we need to do more than just say. We need to learn how to be in good relations with one another. There needs to be education, and we need to learn how to understand what a good, healthy relationship is. How do we communicate? How do we listen? How do we be in a good, healthy relationship? And I think some of the work of the church will be, how do we build good, healthy communities of faith? Because that's what we need to be sustainable as a church, because I can tell you that church is not attractive to young people when we're all fighting with each other. Who wants to be involved in that? It's negative. So I know we're in my community, kids won't come, but hopefully, like we can make some good changes and do the good work. But that means we have to humble ourselves, and I don't know if we're ready for that.
Well, thank you, Bev, for that.
If I just could say one thing,
Sure.
Tony, and thanks, Bev, for your words. I think we need to be reminded Canada is a multicultural nation, but the United Church of Canada is intercultural, and there is a difference. Multicultural simply means that there are different cultures can coexist side by side. Intercultural calls upon us to dialogue between cultures, to get to know each other, and so develop a intercultural culture. The need for dialogue and for us to get to know it. It's not just having the potluck and I carry the curry goat, the indigenous carry the fish and my friends from Ghana carry the oil dog or whatever else, and whatever St. Kitts will carry into the issue, I don't know. But it's more than just kind of different foods. At General Council, I ended my speaker talk about how do you do chicken. It's for us to not only from you to find out how I do my chicken and why I do the chicken in that way, and for me to learn from you how you do yours. And slowly to determine, to discover that by that interchange, by that dialogue that will be happening, by that relationship that we're building, that enables understanding each other, it begins to affect even how I do my chicken in the long run. So I plead that the prophetic stance of the United Church of Canada to be intercultural, and it is a prophetic stance. Will motivate us on this anti-racism experience in our right relations experiences. Tony, you're tired of beating the drum of talking about dialogue. We need to dialogue. We need to dialogue. We need to dialogue. Almost every meeting you come to, you remind us of that. This is what when the church made the stance that we are seeking for an intercultural vision. The church was in fact saying, "Come, people. Let us dialogue. Let us get to know each other. Let us not just stay in our camps and look over at each other. Find out, share your culture a little." And I think if we go on that road, then we have much to say to Canada and the world. We're not yet able to say because we have not fully started to involve ourselves in that intercultural dialogue. Here I stand. I can go no further.
Great. Thank you. I think we're going to go right into Pamela's presentation. So we'll move over to Pamela. So Pamela is with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. She does human rights and anti-racism training. She's an anti-racism educator. And we've been working on different aspects of the work that we've been doing within the church with Pamela in different ways. And we welcome her to share here today. Let me just get the screen up.
And while you're getting the screen up, I'm going to say that our executive director is with us, and she is going to begin by talking about today, what's important about December 10th.
Yes.
Right? And so, next slide, please. I will talk a little bit about ourselves first, and then we'll go into the presentation.
So first of all, I have to say I'm very pleased to see the church that I've called my church since I was 3 years old, and that's over 60 years. um, working on this issue. And I want all the churches, and the church I go to currently has a lot of older people, and I've seen the resistance that they've had over time to, like, even the LGBTQ issues. But I've also seen with the leadership of the ministers that we've had and the support of the congregation, we have been able to move forward. And I would like to hope that we can continue to do this important work. And the white people have a very important role. And I would see our role in this as listening and trying to understand without trying to refute everything. And secondly, becoming allies and supporting people who are doing this work, because it's hard work and it takes a long time. I've been working at the research center since 1992. I'm a lawyer by education, and I always wanted to work somewhere where I thought I could make a difference. And I hope that I have made a difference. And I'm also a law professor. I teach constitutional law. And I can tell you the law schools have a long way to go to talk about your systemic issues. They're trying, but they've got, for take Indigenous people, they've tried to sort of, our universities tried to incorporate and welcome more Indigenous people, but it has not been successful. They do not feel welcomed. They do not get dialogue. They don't, I've had so many students who are needing human rights or who are different in some way tend to find us at the research center. And I've talked to many of them. And I'm sort of their little hole in the safe place to come. And I've heard it all, and we have a long way to go.
I'm Pamela Dos-Ramis, and I'm a human rights educator at the Research Center. And just briefly, I do presentations on human rights. And most recently, actually this year, have been doing a lot of anti-racism education with a couple of my colleagues. So we have been busy, and I think our busyness started in May with Tony's Ethical Dilemma series. And so it's been good, though. It's been good with so many people wanting to learn about anti-racism and how they can affect change within their organizations. Next slide, please. And this is yours, Linda.
Okay, so the Research Center, I'm always surprised that a lot of people have never heard of us. We don't have a huge budget for marketing. Our goal is to have a more just and inclusive community. It's our long-standing goal. We are funded for the most part by the Alberta Law Foundation, which is actually interest that comes off of trust accounts that lawyers charge when people give them money. The interest goes to the Law Foundation, and the Law Foundation funds various groups that are doing, as you can well imagine, there's lots of work needed for vulnerable people who can't afford lawyers, who can't get the information that they need for their situations. We also get some money from the Human Rights Commission and occasionally from the Alberta government, depending on which government happens to be in force. I encourage you all to visit our website. We're very proud of our website. We've been posting as much as we can because, of course, we're not able to go out anywhere in person right now. And there's lots of free resources. We're updating it regularly. And in particular, there's a wonderful site will you be talking about CareEd, Pamela?
No, you will be a little later.
Okay, we'll talk about it in a minute. Our human rights education program, we provide speakers across the province. We do in-services, mostly for teachers or any educators who want to teach these issues. And we support them with materials, DVDs or I guess videos, podcasts, anything that we can produce that will help them do a good job of teaching these issues. We also do research and publish that research. And we also get many calls from people who are concerned about various and sundry issues. We've had many calls about racism, anti-racism. We've also had, there's a cost to the work we do. We'll talk about that, but it's not always happy calls. We've had a few interesting calls. Right now, we're getting a lot of calls because they see civil liberties in our title. So they think that we'll be sympathetic to those people who don't want to wear masks. And I can tell you right now, as a person who's been locked up in my house for many months, I'm not one of those people. So they don't get much sympathy from me. We don't do advocacy. By that, I mean we don't lobby the government, and we don't take on individual cases. But the other thing that we do, because of the wonderful support we get from the Law Foundation, is we don't charge for our presentations. So we're able to reach everybody as much as possible, as much as our resources make us help. And I've offered many times to do stuff at our church. I think once they took me up on it, but we've got lots of things we could be doing in the United Church beyond Tony stuff. And I hope someday that we can continue our work, or we will continue our work with at least with Tony for sure. So today, December 10th, is a really important date. Human Rights Day is really significant, and it's the most important day at the center. So because and that's another thing I wanted to say, the United Church, to me, seems to be more open to interfaith dialogue. Like we've had rabbis and Muslim leaders and Buddhism and all that in our church. So we know we've got a model for dialoguing culturally, and we can build on that. But anyways, getting back to the Human Rights Day, it is the celebration of the signing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Really a significant document, and its original intention was the idea that we wouldn't have wars anymore if we respected everybody's human rights. Now we know that things have not been perfect, but we also know that there are many very significant principles in that document, and that Canada has signed several declarations and conventions under that document, and we have a duty to comply with it. And we should be holding our leaders to account. And of course, in the time of COVID, we've seen a role for the UN in terms of the human rights implications of COVID around the world and in Canada. We've seen incidents here in Canada. In the past, when we had H1N1 here, we saw very negative implications on, especially on Indigenous people, where they sent body bags up to a reserve in Manitoba. So there are all kinds of activities that our government is doing, and the UN does provide us with one avenue for saying, look, this is what the global community says. This is so important because we don't do advocacy. We have to educate people so they get the tools that they can have to stand up for their rights or stand up for others' rights, get the remedies they need. Indigenous people are reluctant to go to the Human Rights Commission. There's a long history behind that. And we've been working on trying to improve that relationship. It's because it's run by the government, right? So that's a very big barrier to Indigenous people. But we have tried to educate the group, the Human Rights Commission, about how to be more welcoming. And we've also set up a website called the CARET, Calgary Anti-Racism Education. We've had this year, since COVID has hit, we've had 1.5 million hits on that website. It's very all over the world. People are looking at it to learn about white privilege, and we get lots of emails with disputes about our policies and our beliefs, some of which we take on and some of which we file in the round filing cabinet, because some people, you just, when they say they wish we were dead, there's really not a lot you can, discuss. That's a big challenge. The other challenge is right now, of course, getting into the schools is impossible, and having to quickly switch over to technology that we're not familiar with, because I'm the second oldest person. We're kind of all sort of up there when it comes to technology, and our kids usually shake their heads. So that's been a big challenge, and the hate mail and the ignorance and fear that we see can be discouraging for our work. But on the other hand, we've had some very heartfelt contacts from the public, people thanking us for the work that we're doing, encouraging us, and hope, and even deciding to give us $10 a month or something for our work, and that's really heartening. And I hope this isn't just a flash in the pan. Like, this is something that all the people that work with me are committed. That's why we're doing this work. This is our life's work. This is our commitment to making Alberta, because that's our mandate, but making the whole country, if we can, a more just and inclusive country.
When we're talking about anti-racism, it's really important to understand what it is. And so for us at the Research Center, it's a framework for ending racism that addresses racism as a system of unequal institutional power between white people, people of color, and Indigenous people. It's the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices, and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. And Paul talked about this. It's an active way of seeing and being in the world in order to transform it. So that's on an individual level. Because racism occurs at all levels and in all spheres of society, and because it can produce and maintain exclusionary levels and areas, anti-racism is necessary in all aspects of society, because it doesn't just happen in the classroom, in the workplace, in the church, or in selected aspects of our lives. And when we look at anti-racism theory, it analyzes and critiques racism and how it operates, which then gives us a basis for taking action to dismantle and eliminate it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach to doing anti-racism. Our anti-racism education focuses on self-awareness, because self-awareness is key. So self-awareness and understanding what racism, including what systemic racism looks like. When we do our workshops, we use several experiential activities to help folks understand what it is, what to look for, how to identify it generally and personally, how nuanced and subtle it can be, how to talk about it, how to address it, and so on. Racism is a pattern of systematic behaviors resulting in the denial of opportunities or privileges by one social group to another. Overt racism is intentional, where a particular group is judged inferior or unworthy and treated as such. Covert racism tends to be unintentional, where misinformation or wrong assumptions can lead to inaccurate assessments or inappropriate treatment. Covert unintentional racism is much less likely to be challenged and changed because there's no awareness of wrongdoing. The key to changing unintentional racism lies in self awareness and examining basic assumptions. And in order to understand and address racism, individuals need to have a clear understanding of what it is and how it operates. They also need to recognize what they have internalized about themselves and others, albeit unconsciously, and how that could affect interactions with others. As mentioned earlier, we all have biases and we need to discover how we learned and internalized our biases. Many of them may be unconscious biases, meaning that we may not even be aware that we have them. And we need to ensure that they don't adversely affect our interactions with folks who are different to us in any way. People who presume they're free of racism really misunderstand or underestimate the power of modern advertising. Racism can occur as unintentional action by well meaning, good hearted, caring individuals who are probably no less free from cultural bias than the general public. And people often assume that their good intentions automatically make them helpful. In our workshops, we identify the three groups of people: Indigenous people, people of color, and white people, each of which affect and are affected by racism differently. The three groups have to be named in order to understand racism and how it works. For example, in Canada, our systems, for the most part, have been designed by and for white people, which means that white people have benefits within these systems that people of color and Indigenous people do not have. We believe that understanding racism is important for everyone on an individual level, regardless of background. For white people, it helps to understand socialization and can lead to a commitment to uncover and unlearn biases and to be allies with people of color and Indigenous people. For people of color and Indigenous people, it can legitimize feelings and experiences they may have had or are currently having. Is understanding racism and how it operates helps us all to make sense of our lived experiences. And Paul mentioned the experience of being told that a person is colorblind. In our workshops, we talk about liberal racism, those comments and statements which are meant to be inclusive but end up being quite the opposite. So in several of our workshops, we've had people say, "Oh, but I'm colorblind. I don't see color and I don't discriminate." My response is, "Oh my dear gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that. When did your doctor diagnose you?" So, and I think that helps the person to think about what they're saying. So in our anti-racism workshops, as I mentioned, we focus on self-awareness. We believe that understanding is critical, and we want everybody to have comfort with the terminology associated with learning about racism and anti-racism. So we spend quite a bit of time talking about terminology. Because you have to be able, if you're going to be an anti-racist person, you're going to do anti-racism work, you have to understand the terminology. We help folks uncover internalized and unconscious biases. These are biases that we often don't realize we have, and we don't realize where we learned them. We talk about discomfort being a good thing, and that sitting with discomfort helps in the overall learning process. We talk about cultural competence generally, and that is a lifelong um, thing, that you don't just go to a workshop and become culturally competent, or have a friend from a different cultural group and all of a sudden you're culturally competent. It's an ongoing experience. We also talk about actions to promote understanding and inclusion, and we talk about actions to address incidents of racism. Next slide, please. So folks have told us that these are some of their key learnings from our workshops. So, learning about the history of racism in Canada, starting with 1492, and dispelling the myth of Canada always being welcoming and inclusive. As Paul indicated, it is really not. And that's not just history, it continues to today. Racism has changed its face in how it looks in Canada. We do self, that they've benefited from self-awareness activities. And I should go back to the history. One of the one of the things that people are always surprised about, and I think this was mentioned earlier too, is that the Ku Klux Klan was alive and well in Western Canada, particularly Saskatchewan and Alberta, in the 1920s, early 1930s, and that they were active petitions and work to try and discourage Black people from moving from the United States up to Canada and particularly Alberta. We do several self-awareness activities, and people appreciate these activities. We actually do them in the workshop, and then they can go away afterwards and continue that work. People are appreciative of learning what can be done individually, collectively, and organizationally. And people appreciate any help we give them to develop organizational change initiatives. Next slide, please. And so when you begin to consider institutional change, change has to begin with leaders. And I have a handout that we had prepared for the Alberta Human Rights Commission when we did a workshop for them a couple of years ago on understanding racism, racial discrimination, and what you can do about it as an organization. So we talk about the self-awareness of change leaders. Change has to be directed from the top. So when you're looking at changes in an organization, do the boards of directors or whatever they're called in your organization and senior management fully understand the change process that needs to happen? Are they self-aware, or are they just rubber stamping because it's best, it's a good thing to do, the change that needs to happen? Are they fully and visibly and audibly on board? What are they saying? What are they doing? Have they signed off on any plans you come up with? And when you're looking at institutional change, how is your vision inclusive? How is your mission inclusive? What does it say? What does it not say? When you look at examining your policies and procedures, you look for exclusion, you look for bias. Who is being excluded? And how old is this policy? Does it need to be revised to address current issues? And if you're going to have a group to look at your policies, procedures, to look at your systems, is it a diverse group? Because that group needs to examine and review those systemic issues. And how are your recommendations to change when they're developed? Valued. They have to be valued and seen to be valued and heard to be valued by the leaders. Is there an open communication process? Is there open communication with the process you're going through in terms of looking at this change? And is the change going to be reviewed regularly? Does everybody know and understand the implementation and review process? Because when you have just a few people leading this, people always tend to feel that they have to, that they're being told to do something. Whereas if people truly understand why change needs to be happening, then they tend to be on board. So this is not an issue where a group in your church decides that change needs to happen and puts out recommendations on how it needs to happen. Everybody needs to be involved. a really interesting resource right now that lots of people are accessing is called White Fragility, which is aimed at helping white people understand what racism is and why it is so difficult for white people to talk about racism. The correct title is White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And it's on our resources list. Another resource that is very valuable and is very new too is called This Book is Anti-Racist. And it really is an excellent book, particularly at helping young people understand what racism is. And at the end of every chapter, the author gives you homework to go do. Another book that's trending quite a lot is it's by Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Oh, what happened here? It's by Ibram Kendi, and it's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. So on the list, there are several resources that you could look at if you want to, to, to learn more. And of course, Linda mentioned our CARID website, which is actually a self-study website that was developed to help teachers understand anti-racism, and to be able to teach about it in their classrooms, and also to be able to teach from an anti-racist perspective. So questions, comments?
I think it's very interesting that the similar point out that for me, when I talk about it, it's always about a centeredness. It's always about being in your body and being reacting and being self-aware. And if we are to really truly engage on a human level and on a level that has awareness and empathy and constructive modes of interacting, then we need to find that space of centering. And so I'm glad that you focused on that portion of it, because I think that to me is sort of the critical argument on how we inhabit spaces, whether we take on those institutional powers like privilege and benefit, or whether we kind of hide behind them and don't really recognize that um, they are constructing the world around us.
Yes, and we talk about the fact that this is not easy work. It's not easy work to uncover the biases, the assumptions, the beliefs you have that are destructive and not constructive in the way that it doesn't build community. It doesn't help you to build an anti-racist perspective. And getting all caught up in guilt and shame and blame is unhelpful and very immobilizing. I see Linda shaking her head. Did you want to?
I agree with everything you say. You have to have hope that things are going to get better. You have to believe that, or there's no reason to talk about this. We have to believe there's something that can be done, and we have
Yes.
to commit to that. And I think we're talking to a lot of the people who want to do something and already.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the
Absolutely.
audience isn't that sympathetic, and we have to make a cost benefit, which, as lawyers, I hate that term. I think people should do things because it's the right thing to do. But there are some people that need to be told how you can benefit, how getting along with everybody and utilizing all the talent that we have in our diverse country that's not being used right now. The value and how it's going to benefit all of us. Sometimes that's how you reach them. And, they were just talking on CBC this afternoon about how, we've sort of dropped the ball on the Syrian refugees that came here. because all these things have been going on
Mm.
since. But one of the biggest issues they're facing is not being able to work in their profession. So there again, we're in the middle of a health crisis, and there are people who could be helping us deal with it, but because of, a lack of desire and all these systemic barriers, they're not able to do that. And that's most unfortunate because it's life or death for all of us.
Thank you. I think if we have any final questions for the chat, or Deborah, if you have any final questions or contributions to.
I didn't have a question. There was someone who asked in the chat if this group did work outside of Alberta. So I'm not sure if that was something that we were able. Does the research center work outside of Alberta? Brenda asked that. Yeah.
I can answer that. So sometimes it is a matter that's of interest, importance across the country, and we certainly wouldn't shy away from that. And we have done seminars where, people from outside Alberta have been included.
Mhm.
We don't get, our mandate isn't so much that, but obviously if it affects the whole country, we're not going to shy away from it. Because it's probably a very important issue.
Mhm.
So, but
Yeah.
we live in Calgary, and our mandated area of doing education is Alberta.
Alberta. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Yeah. And I think someone asked if Tony can make these slides or make the presentation available by email. So Tony, you can respond to that.
Yes, I'll. Those that would like can email me. The email was on the registration form that went out. So thank you. Yep.
You're very welcome. And I personally really congratulate the United Church on wanting to do this systemic work, because it's not easy. It's long term. There's no overnight solutions, as you will have found out. And everyone's voices need to be heard and valued.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, thank you for all those words and contributions. We will convene again next week for those that are following our Advent series, and we'll have Murray Pruden, Reverend Murray Pruden, who is the Executive Minister for Indigenous Ministries and Justice, and another individual who comes from the Cunning Nation, Spirit River Stripe Wolf, talking about the Two-Spirit and LGBTQ aspect of these discussions and how that conforms and performs with the idea of anti-racism within the church, and looking at some of that history and some of the history of the LGBTQ movement that we didn't get to tonight. The church shifted, and now we're looking at how institutional change happens for the anti-racist portion of it, and where we've come from in the LGBTQ portion. Pam, did you want to add anything towards our ending here?
I just wanted to say thank you so much to Pamela and Linda and Deborah and Paul and Adele, who was with us last week and who joined us again tonight. And I put the link for next week and also the event on December 20th in the chat. So I really encourage you. I mean, as Adele and Paul said, this is about all of us. We are the church. And so I encourage you to come back and explore those intersections for Two-Spirit and the anti-racism. And I'm really excited to hear from both of those folks. So it's been a pleasure to be a part of these conversations, and feel free to send the invite. You don't have to be part of the United Church to still come and be part of the conversation. So we know it's late for some of you, but thank you for investing the time in this, because it really does matter.
Yes.
Thank
Any
you
final
for
words,
inviting
Deborah?
us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Mm-hmm. Any final words, Deborah?
Nope, that's it. It's been a pleasure to be participating in this, and I appreciated through this last part of our conversation some really key actionable type of learnings that we were able to glean from this that we might be able to take away to start in our own communities of faith and the networks around how we can start actioning this work.
Mm-hmm. That's great. We are adding a Indigenous Christmas service on Christmas Eve. So for those of you that are interested, you can also look out for that information. And we thank you for coming tonight and taking part here. We'll have a time in our next session for some review and discussion, and also our final session on the 20th, where we'll have more of a presentation of service on these issues and on the Indigenous response to the anti-racism movement, and how we can work together toward a better future. So thank you for everyone, and be well and have a good night.
Hey.
Two.
Take care.